Have you ever watched your team pull off an upset victory and then found yourself saying, I knew they were going to win? Or maybe you've seen a company fail and thought the warning signs were there all along. Perhaps you've heard about a celebrity breakup and immediately thought, I could tell that relationship was not going to last. These examples share an important feature. Once we know the outcome, our judgments about the past often change. Outcomes that once seemed uncertain can begin to look obvious, sometimes even inevitable. But was it really? Before the game ended, before the company failed, before the relationship ended, the future was still uncertain. Multiple outcomes were possible. Yet once we know the ending, we often feel as though we saw it coming all along. Psychologists call this phenomena hindsight bias. Hindsight bias is the tendency to see an outcome as having been more predictable after it happened than it actually was beforehand. And it's an incredibly common part of human thinking. Researchers have been studying this phenomena for decades. One of the pioneers was psychologist Baruch Fischhoff, whose experiments in the 1970s showed that simply learning an outcome could change people's judgments about how predictable that outcome had been. In one of his now classic studies, Fischhoff asked participants to read about historical events and estimate how likely different outcomes would have seemed before those events took place. Some participants already knew the outcome, where others did not. Simply knowing the outcome systematically changed people's judgments of how likely that outcome had been. In other words, knowing the ending changed their perception of the beginning. This finding was important because it suggested that hindsight bias is not just a figure of speech or a failure of honesty. Outcome knowledge genuinely changes the way people think about the past. Since Fischhoff's early work, researchers have found hindsight bias in many different settings, including medicine, business, politics, sports, and everyday life. In fact, hindsight bias is one of the most robust findings in judgment and decision-making research. Once we know what happened, it becomes surprisingly difficult to put ourselves back into a state of not knowing. This is why it's sometimes called the I knew it all along effect. But notice something important. Hindsight bias isn't simply remembering the outcome. Once we know what happened, the past itself can begin to look different. Events that once seemed ambiguous suddenly appear meaningful. Details that seemed unimportant start to look like obvious clues. And the outcome can begin to feel much more predictable, or even inevitable, than it actually was. To see why this matters, consider a situation involving a highly competitive job search. Imagine that hundreds of people apply for a position at a well-known company. One applicant, Elena, has several years of experience, strong recommendations, and a successful track record in similar roles. At the same time, she's changing industries, has never managed a large team, and is competing against many other qualified applicants. Now, suppose Elena gets the job. People might say, of course she got it. Her experience made her stand out. You could tell that she was exactly what they were looking for. She had all the right qualifications. But now suppose Elena doesn't get the job. Suddenly people might say, the competition was just too strong. Switching industries probably hurt her chances. She didn't have enough management experience. The same information can support very different stories depending on the outcome we know. Once we know the outcome, it becomes easy to forget just how much uncertainty existed beforehand. The details that fit the outcome suddenly stand out, and the outcome itself starts to seem more predictable than it really was. This tendency for the past to become increasingly predictable in retrospect is sometimes called creeping determinism, a term that Fischhoff used to capture the feeling that events were always leading toward the outcome we now know occurred. The phrase captures an important idea. As we look backward, events seem to move from being uncertain and open-ended to being determined and inevitable. The uncertainty that existed at the time begins to disappear. In retrospect, events can begin to look as though they were always leading toward the outcome that occurred. But that sense of inevitability is usually an illusion. At the time decisions are made, people almost never have perfect information. The future contains many possibilities, and outcomes are often influenced by uncertainty, chance, and factors that no one could fully anticipate. One of the dangers of hindsight bias is that it can make us forget that uncertainty ever existed. This tendency has important consequences for judgment and decision making. First, hindsight bias can lead us to become overconfident in our ability to predict events. If we consistently believe we knew it all along, we might start to overestimate our knowledge and our judgment. Second, it can distort how we evaluate the actions of other people. When an outcome turns out badly, we may think of someone should have seen it coming. And third, it can interfere with learning from experience. When an outcome turns out well, we may give it too much credit to skill and not enough credit to luck or circumstance. If we convince ourselves that an outcome was obvious all along, we may never stop to ask one of the most important questions in judgment and decision making. What did people know and not know at the time? That question lies at the heart of fair evaluations and effective learning. To understand decisions fairly, we need to remember that people act without knowing how the story will end. As you will see, hindsight bias is not simply a curious error in thinking. It reflects some very basic features of how memory, reasoning, and explanation work. Once we know an outcome, it becomes surprisingly difficult to imagine not knowing it. And that simple fact can profoundly shape how we remember the past, evaluate decisions, and think about the future.